The surgery was successful. However, tests after the operation found cancer had been present. My medical team therefore advised that I should undergo a course of preventative chemotherapy.
2 cancer diagnoses in 1 year, 1 kingdom shaken, and a royal family on the edge. When King Charles III first revealed his cancer diagnosis in February 2024, it sent shockwaves through the nation. The monarch, only a year into his reign, was already facing a battle that threatened not only his health, but the very stability of the crown itself. The news was met with stunned silence and a flurry of public concern. Royal watchers clung to each carefully crafted palace statement, parsing every word for meaning. But before the world could recover from that revelation, an even more devastating announcement came this time from Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Following what was initially described as a successful abdominal surgery, doctors discovered something far more serious. Cancer had been present. The princess, known for her elegance and poise, now found herself at the center of a private war with a very public face. And just like that, 2 of the monarchy's most visible and beloved figures were simultaneously plunged into the fight of their lives. The gravity of the situation hit like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a family in crisis, it was the royal institution itself. Questions erupted across the media, echoing through the halls of Buckingham Palace and beyond. What would happen if both King Charles and Princess Catherine were unable to fulfill their duties? Was the monarchy prepared for such a devastating blow? And perhaps the most painful question of all, could this be the beginning of the end? Inside royal circles, the pressure mounted. There were whispers of abdication, of a regency, of unprecedented change. But no one in the royal household would speak publicly. The silence was deafening. Every public appearance was dissected, every photograph analyzed. Every glance or smile from Prince William carried more weight than ever before. And with reason. The emotional toll on him was undeniable. In the span of months, he had gone from heir apparent to the emotional anchor of a family unraveling. Behind closed doors, those closest to the couple spoke of a storm unlike anything they had weathered. William, once known for his quiet strength, was now visibly strained. As a son, he worried for his father. As a husband, he stood helplessly by his wife's side. And as the future king, he was staring down a role that might come sooner than expected. The British people, known for their stoicism, watched on with growing concern. 2 royal icons, both symbols of continuity and tradition, were now fighting invisible battles. The strain could be felt throughout the nation, an undercurrent of fear mixed with hope. But the palace offered little clarity. There were no dramatic press conferences, no tell-all interviews, only tightly controlled statements and carefully choreographed appearances. And yet, in the midst of all this uncertainty, something was happening beneath the surface. Something few expected. While the world focused on the fragility of the monarchy, a quiet but powerful transformation was already underway. But while the palace kept its secrets, the transformation happening behind the scenes would leave the nation stunned. When the cameras stopped rolling, Kate disappeared. But what happened behind those palace walls changed everything. It began with a statement carefully written, emotionally restrained, explaining that the Princess of Wales had undergone abdominal surgery. The public responded with concern, unaware that the real storm was still ahead. Weeks later, after cautious silence from the palace, came the truth. Cancer had been discovered. The admission was a gut punch, not just for the public, but for those who had always seen Kate as the unshakable face of grace and strength in the royal family. And then, she vanished. No appearances, no interviews, no commentary, just silence. But that silence wasn't absence. It was the sound of a woman preparing for war. While the world speculated, Kate Middleton was inside Kensington Palace, retreating from royal obligations, shielding herself from relentless cameras, and beginning one of the hardest journeys of her life. In March 2024, without public ceremony or fanfare, she started preventive chemotherapy. It was quiet, intentional. Not because she was hiding, but because she was fighting in a way the public could never fully understand. Cancer does not just threaten the body, it invades every part of a person's identity. And for Kate, who had spent years in the public eye, always composed, always expected to smile, this illness was something she could not perform through. She needed to become someone else, not a royal by duty, but a survivor by necessity. Behind those palace walls, the transformation had begun. Her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, became her sole focus. She shifted from public speeches and national tours to school runs, bedtime routines, and quiet moments of comfort. She was still a princess, but her crown for now was motherhood. It was in that role that Kate found a different kind of strength, not in waving from balconies or attending galas, but in holding her family together while enduring one of the most physically and emotionally draining experiences of her life. Many wondered why she had stepped away for so long. The truth? This battle wasn't meant for the spotlight. This was healing in private, grieving her former self, accepting a new reality. And within that hidden fight, something remarkable took root. Kate was no longer just the polished royal, standing beside William. She was now facing the rawest form of human vulnerability. And in that space, without cameras, courtiers, or public expectation, she began to rebuild. The silence that surrounded her became louder than any public speech. It spoke of resilience, of dignity, of quiet rage against the fragility of life. While some questioned her retreat, those who truly understood knew better. This was not a woman breaking. This was a woman preparing. What she lost in visibility, she gained in fire. And by the time the palace gates opened again, she was no longer returning to her old life. She was stepping into a new one, forged not by protocol, but by pain, courage, and quiet power. But her reappearance would redefine who she was and what the monarchy truly meant to her. She came back, not with grandeur, but with grace. And it was more powerful than anyone expected. After months of silence and absence, the world waited anxiously to see what version of Kate Middleton would return. Would she be diminished by her illness? Would she retreat from the spotlight for good? Or would she re-emerge clinging to royal tradition, masking the pain behind palace walls? What no one anticipated was the quiet force that stepped forward, not weakened, but transformed. Her first public appearance at the Chelsea Flower Show wasn't a grand statement. It didn't need to be. She didn't come with trumpets or titles, but with calm elegance and a softness that disarmed everyone. The applause wasn't just for her presence, it was for her resilience and for the message she delivered simply by standing there. Then came Southport. An event meant to raise awareness for cancer support services quickly turned into something more intimate and emotional. Kate wasn't just attending, she was connecting, listening, touching hands, speaking not as a royal fulfilling obligations, but as a woman who had walked through the same fire, as those she was comforting. The warmth in her tone, the understanding in her eyes, it was all unmistakably real. Gone was the distance that often surrounds the royal family. In its place stood someone human, vulnerable, and unimaginably strong. For those watching closely, it wasn't just the public that was moved. Prince William, known for his restraint, struggled to contain his emotions. At multiple engagements, his admiration for Kate was visible in every glance. In moments where she addressed survivors or smiled at children, he stood nearby not as a prince protecting a princess, but as a husband watching someone he loved rise from unimaginable hardship. The unspoken bond between them had deepened, shaped by fear, pain, and a renewed sense of purpose. And the public noticed. News outlets scrambled to capture the shift. Headlines no longer described her as just the Princess of Wales. Now, they used words like pillar, fighter, and future queen. The fairy tale image that had once defined Kate was evolving into something far more powerful. She had stepped out from the shadow of royal pageantry and into her own story, one forged not by fantasy, but by fire. Her presence now carried a new kind of weight, not from titles or expectation, but from lived experience. And the people responded with overwhelming respect. The monarchy, long critiqued for being out of touch, suddenly felt different. Through Kate, it had gained a new face, not flawless or unreachable, but weathered, tested, and still standing. Her reappearance wasn't just a return, it was a revelation. She had survived, grown, and in the process helped restore something the public hadn't felt in a long time: authentic admiration for the royal family. But admiration doesn't shield from sorrow, and while the cameras captured her grace, they couldn't see the storm still brewing beneath the surface. But behind Kate's poised smile was another storm, one only her closest family could truly understand. He waved. He smiled. But behind the king's calm eyes was a war being fought in silence. When King Charles III stepped out in Bradford, the cameras captured a familiar image: a composed monarch, nodding to the crowd, exchanging polite words, and offering a quiet thumbs up. To a local florist, to most it seemed routine, but to those who had followed the unfolding storm, it was anything but. That single gesture, small, simple, was loaded with meaning. Because behind that subtle nod was a man carrying the unimaginable weight of both a nation and his own mortality. The king wasn't just present, he was enduring. Since the shocking revelation of his cancer diagnosis in early 2024, every public appearance from Charles had become a message. Not in speeches, but in gestures. Not in declarations, but in glances. At a time when the monarchy appeared to be teetering on the edge of uncertainty, his presence alone became a symbol of stability. He wasn't seeking sympathy, he was offering reassurance. When he smiled at the florist and quietly stated he was feeling better, it wasn't just an update, it was a signal to a country desperate for hope. And it worked. The moment went viral, not because of its grandeur, but because of its humility. This was not the pomp and pageantry of a coronation, it was a man in the middle of chemotherapy, speaking to a stranger with kindness and vulnerability. That thumbs up became more powerful than a press release. It told people that even in sickness, their king was still showing up, still smiling, still standing. This understated resilience drew instant comparisons to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth. She too had led with quiet strength, weathering crisis after crisis without ever faltering in public. But while Elizabeth's stoicism was often seen as a product of her generation, Charles's calmness carried a deeper intimacy. His leadership wasn't detached, it was personal. In a world where monarchs once ruled with distance, he was ruling with humanity. There were no grand speeches announcing his suffering, no dramatic gestures demanding attention. Instead, there were garden parties, walkabouts, and short interactions, each moment laced with grace and courage. The cancer was never denied, but it also never defined him. That balance between vulnerability and command is what set this chapter of his reign apart. His presence became a balm for a nation fraying at the edges, torn between tradition and transition, fear and admiration. Charles had waited his entire life to wear the crown. And now, he wore it in the most fragile chapter of his life with a kind of power that didn't need to shout. His leadership spoke not through authority, but through action. Not in control, but in compassion. And yet, for all his quiet dignity, Charles was not the only one rewriting the narrative of the monarchy. Because while the king showed the world strength, it was Kate who showed them what transformation looks like. She was the Duchess of Cambridge. Now, she's becoming the soul of the monarchy. What began as quiet resilience was now emerging as something far greater. Catherine, once admired for her elegance and steady grace, had stepped into a space no one fully anticipated, not just a royal returning from illness, but a force quietly reshaping the heart of the institution itself. It wasn't through flashy headlines or dramatic gestures, it was through her unshakable presence, measured, intentional, deeply human. In April 2024, that presence was formally acknowledged when she was appointed to the Order of the Companions of Honor, a recognition historically reserved for trailblazers in science, art, and public service. For Kate, it wasn't just a title, it was a turning point, a royal acknowledgement not of lineage, but of earned merit. That same month, she hosted the Together at Christmas concert at Westminster Abbey. But this time, it felt different. The event was meant to be festive, yet the tone she brought was unmistakably intimate. When she spoke to the audience, her voice wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, real, and the words didn't feel like they were read from a script, they felt lived. Kate spoke not as a future queen, but as a mother, a daughter, a survivor. Her quiet heartbreak bled through the warmth of her message. And in that moment, the British public saw something they hadn't before. Not just a royal doing her duty, but a woman whose pain had deepened her purpose. Behind the scenes, this transformation didn't go unnoticed. King Charles, known for his sensitivity and deep emotional compass, had long viewed Kate with fondness. But now, that fondness had turned to reverence. Sources close to the family revealed that he called her his pillar, and in private moments, at Sandringham, he reportedly praised her strength, telling those around him that he couldn't imagine facing his diagnosis without her steady support. Their relationship, once rooted in formality, had evolved into something closer akin to a father and daughter navigating personal storms together. As the monarchy endured its most vulnerable chapter in decades, it was Kate who brought a kind of quiet cohesion, a sense of moral clarity the public instinctively gravitated toward. There was a shift, not just in how the public perceived her, but in how she moved through her role. Her appearances were less about formality and more about meaning. Her words, once filtered through layers of royal etiquette, now cut deeper. There was a grounding to her now, as if every step she took was no longer guided by royal protocol, but by a deeper, hard-earned understanding of what leadership truly requires. Not dominance, but dignity. Not power, but presence. And it was this very presence that began to redefine the modern monarchy. In her eyes, people didn't just see a duchess. They saw someone who had walked through fire and emerged softer, not colder. Her ability to connect was no longer symbolic. It was sincere. She didn't just represent the crown. She humanized it. For years, royal advisors had debated how to modernize the firm, how to make it more accessible, more grounded. And yet, here she was doing just that. Not with statements, but with silence, not by commanding attention, but by earning respect. Kate's evolution wasn't manufactured. It wasn't orchestrated in palace meetings or spun by royal publicists. It was born in quiet recovery rooms, in tearful family nights, in moments of doubt that no camera ever captured. And now, that evolution was shaping a monarchy in desperate need of redefinition. And while Kate was stepping into her future role, William was standing right beside her, his heart full of pride. He stood tall, but those who watched closely saw the pain behind his eyes. For Prince William, 2024 was not a chapter, it was a crucible. In his own words, it was the hardest year of his life. A year defined not by royal duties or diplomatic successes, but by emotional warfare behind palace doors. He was not only witnessing his father battle cancer, he was standing beside his wife as she faced a diagnosis that could have shattered their world. And while the nation saw a composed figure shaking hands and delivering speeches, those closest to him knew better. They saw a man carrying the weight of a kingdom, a family, and a future all at once. Behind the cameras, he was a father first, holding bedtime routines together, answering impossible questions from his children about why Mummy was gone. He was a husband second silent in hospital corridors, gripping Kate's hand as she fought to heal in the shadows. And then, when the doors opened and protocol called, he became the Prince of Wales, walking into public spaces with the same determined calm that once defined his grandmother. Except, this wasn't inherited. This was earned. At the Chelsea Flower Show, the cameras caught what words never could. William watched from a distance as Kate interacted with children and volunteers. There was a tenderness in his expression, a mix of relief and reverence. For him, this wasn't just a royal engagement. It was proof that she had made it through. Later, at Wimbledon, when their daughter Charlotte joined them, a single moment stood out, Kate gently placing her hand on Charlotte's back. Comforting, grounding. And again, William's eyes told the story. Not of a future king, but of a man, silently overwhelmed by love and pride. Still, even as the emotional storms raged behind the scenes, William never abandoned his role. If anything, his presence in the public eye only grew stronger. At the Earthshot Prize ceremony, he delivered one of his most confident speeches to date, not just because of the subject matter, but because of what it symbolized. A prince stepping out of his father's long shadow. A man no longer following a script, but writing one. His diplomatic appearances in the months that followed were met with global praise, and yet he always returned home not to rest, but to anchor his family. Through all of it, his connection with Kate deepened. What they had endured together had fused something indestructible between them. They were no longer just royals fulfilling inherited roles. They were a united force, partners not only in duty, but in survival. With every public appearance, every shared glance, the world could sense it. These two were preparing for something bigger. Not just a shift in titles, but a shift in the monarchy itself. And yet, just as they seemed to be finding balance, reclaiming peace after months of uncertainty, a distant voice echoed from across the ocean. A voice that didn't just stir emotions. It unsettled everything they had tried so hard to rebuild. But even as William and Kate rose together, one voice from afar shook the calm with chilling words. He said he didn't know how long his father had left, and the world froze. Prince Harry's words, spoken in a BBC interview that was meant to promote peace, instead ignited a storm no one saw coming. In a single sentence, he stripped away the carefully preserved image of calm the palace had worked so hard to maintain. There was no royal filter, no curated message, just raw honesty, unfiltered and unsettling. It didn't sound like a man offering political commentary. It sounded like a son preparing for loss. And in that moment, everything shifted. Until that point, the monarchy had been walking a tightrope, balancing a king's fragile health with a nation's desperate hope for continuity. But Harry's statement cracked the illusion. Suddenly, headlines exploded. Was the king's cancer more advanced than the palace admitted? Had the public been misled? Had Charles, the man who waited a lifetime for the crown, begun quietly preparing for the end? The palace offered no denial, no clarification, nothing. The silence was deafening. It wasn't just the lack of words, it was the strategic stillness. A move so characteristic of the crown, it almost seemed rehearsed. But this time, the silence didn't soothe. It stirred suspicion. People weren't just curious, they were concerned. Because if Harry's words were true, then the monarchy wasn't simply in transition, it was on the brink. Charles responded not with a statement, but with appearances. He stepped out in Bradford, smiled at strangers, spoke softly to a florist. A few days later, he hosted guests at Buckingham Palace, discussing diet and health. These weren't official rebuttals, but they were strategic counters. Small gestures loaded with a singular message. I'm still here. I'm not finished yet. It was subtle defiance against the narrative Harry had unintentionally or intentionally set in motion. But the damage was already done. The emotional landscape had shifted. Questions once whispered in private were now debated publicly. And more painfully, the already fragile bond between two brothers William and Harry was thrust back into the spotlight. What had once been a deeply personal struggle was now a global drama. William, fighting to hold his family and future together, was now being painted as the stoic heir, hiding behind duty. Harry, on the other hand, was recast as the truth-teller, reckless to some, courageous to others. And somewhere between the noise and speculation, the public saw the cost of monarchy not in ceremonies or titles, but in emotion. A family torn, a father quietly battling illness, a son halfway across the world speaking truths the palace couldn't or wouldn't. And yet, amid the chaos, something undeniable began to form. A realization that the monarchy wasn't waiting for change anymore. It was already happening. But, despite whispers and worries, one thing became clear. The future of the monarchy was no longer a question of if, but when. Not just a princess, not just a wife. She is the future queen and the monarchy's quiet revolution. In a year marred by uncertainty, sickness, and public doubt, one figure emerged as the steadying force Britain didn't realize it needed: Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her return from private battle wasn't marked by extravagance or spectacle. It was built on presence, and the world noticed. The more she appeared, the more the nation exhaled. Confidence, once fragile, began to rebuild. Her speeches resonated not as royal obligations, but as human moments. Her interactions with children, cancer survivors, and everyday citizens weren't photo ops, they were acts of genuine empathy. Slowly but surely, public trust shifted, not away from the crown, but toward its future. Whispers inside palace walls had already begun to evolve into serious conversations. Charles remained king, but as his health demanded rest, more responsibility moved quietly into William's and Kate's hands. It wasn't an abdication, not officially, but it was a regency in all but name, a practical transfer of weight from one generation to the next, cloaked in respect and strategy. And at the center of it all stood Kate, not just filling a role, but redefining it. Her influence began where most monarchs never look inside the home. As a mother, her approach was modern, balanced, instinctively attuned to the emotional needs of her children while still preparing them for a life under relentless scrutiny. As a royal, she steered her energy into causes that mattered. Mental health, early childhood, cancer awareness. These weren't charity visits. They were campaigns of compassion. A monarchy long accused of being out of touch now found itself wrapped in the humanity Kate brought to the throne's doorstep. Gone were the days when royal authority came from distance. In its place, she offered proximity. She didn't command, loyalty. She earned it. With William by her side, their unity became symbolic of a new kind of leadership, strong, but not hardened, graceful, but not passive. They didn't just perform royalty, they lived it, quietly embodying the very evolution the institution needed to survive the next century. The shift was undeniable. The monarchy, once defined by rigidity and ceremony, was becoming something else: accessible, empathetic, and emotionally intelligent. This was no longer about preserving a crown. It was about making it matter. And as public admiration surged, the question of when, not if, Kate and William would fully lead became harder to ignore. For the first time in decades, people weren't just watching the royal family, they were believing in it again. But that belief no longer rested on bloodlines or titles. It rested on character. And character, in this new era, looked like a woman who had endured pain in silence and returned with purpose. A woman who carried the past with honor and the future with vision. And as 2025 unfolds, one question remains: will the crown pass with ceremony or with quiet resolve? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.